Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're talking more about yesterday's Balance Council vote results because we just got more information released from the developers about not only which other cards would have won the vote had we had the usual 15 cards selected in each category, but also the ranked order in which those cards received the votes, which we've not seen before, not for this season or even the previous season. So those results are posted here on a Twitter post from one of the developers. I have, since this is, not the easiest thing to follow, or at least not the easiest thing to compare to the previous results, I have pulled those into an Excel document here where I have organized them so that we can more easily identify which votes were repeats from previous seasons looking to counteract the previous votes and what have you. So the big thing here is, of course, we'll focus on Season 2, because Season 1 is something that obviously is old news at this point, but we can circle back to talk about what were votes to undo what happened in Season 1. So in ranked order for power increases for this Season 2, we had Reaver Hunters, Alba Armored Cavalry, Nazca Sergeant, Great Oak, and Oak Critters. So those were the 5 that actually went through. But of course, anything below that did not actually get changed this season because we were limited to just 5 changes per season. If we had 10 or the 15 we had in the previous season, then of course we would have seen these next votes make it through. So Lambert, Eskel makes sense given how we saw Vesemir get approved for the power increase last time. It seemed a little bit strange that only Vesemir had been increased. So yes, it seems that was always the intention, to have the other 2 members of the Witcher trio get buffed as well. They just didn't quite make the cut there. Given how that happened to Vesemir last time, it makes sense to me, at least, that that was the intention and is ultimately the direction that people would like to go in. Bearwisher Adept, next on the list. I'm a little surprised there. Now, it's not like it's the most underpowered card ever to exist, but it's not terrible either. In fact, I actually used it not that long ago in ranked mode, somewhat high-ranked matches, and had pretty decent success with it at that, so I feel like that's a little bit underrated. So it's not a card that I would have prioritized that much. Then again, it's not like it's totally out of nowhere, so at least I can see where people are coming from there. Then we have Philippe, and this would have been to counteract the votes from the previous season. So obviously we know what Philippe was like when he had 6 power. If we had increased the number of votes approved per section, then that would have been canceled out as well. Along with Vanadane, same thing there. Serret, power increase. Serret and Ox definitely feel like they have not been as powerful as maybe they once used to be quite a while back, so this makes sense to me. Then Angus, Jan, and Torres, all of those are votes that would have undone the previous season's results. And at this point, as you can see here, quite a large number of votes would have been to undo the previous season's results. And I get it. Some people didn't like the first season's results, but I think we need to ask ourselves, why was that? Because at a certain point, if we just cancel all the votes every single season, then we're never making any progress. Nothing ever actually changes. And then this whole balance council system is meaningless. So I think the underlying question that we need to ask ourselves, and I think the reason why perhaps many of these votes have been coming in that would have canceled the previous season's results, is that we have not agreed upon what is the desired level of power for cards. Because a lot of people for the first season voted to nerf cards that, yes, were powerful. Maybe they weren't the absolute most powerful cards in the entire game. However, they were certainly still a lot more powerful than cards that see little to no play. So perhaps for people who are in pro rank, or generally high ranking in standard mode, they see these cards that are strong but not ridiculously strong getting these votes to get nerfed, and they say, well, why is this the card that's getting nerfed? Whereas for other people who are maybe not as high up in the ranks but still see those cards being effective, they say, well, okay, sure, maybe it's not the absolute most powerful card, but I still think it should be weaker. So basically, the pro rank players are trying to balance for pro rank, which is already the select few cards that are the most powerful in the entire game. They are using the most overpowered cards because those are the ones you need to win in pro rank, and then they are also accustomed to having those types of cards both in their decks and in their opponent's decks. So what seems like a normal powered card to a high ranking player still feels overpowered to someone who's used to lower rank cards and decks. Contrary to popular belief, that does not necessarily mean that the lower rank players are wrong. It just means that they prefer for cards to, on average, have less power than what the higher rank players want the average cards to have, which may be a big reason why a lot of higher ranking players saw some cards that they thought were good but not overpowered get nerfed, and then want to reverse those nerfs in this round of voting. And so the standard for what constitutes something that should be nerfed and what is fine where it currently is is different between higher rank players and mid to lower rank players. So then on to the power decrease. So in order was Incubus, Riptide, Rainfarn, Madame Marquise Serenity, and Joachim. Now obviously we've seen all these before. We knew that those got approved because those were the 5 that actually did go through. Although I suppose it is still worth at least noting here that that is very significant to at least have that insight to know what order those came in from the standpoint of, okay, if you voted for Joachim just barely made it in, whereas if you voted for Sove, you just barely missed it. So that's important reference because that gives us as voters going forward a better understanding of, okay, these are the cards that didn't quite make it, but we know on a future occasion, if we prioritize them a little bit more, then perhaps they have a chance of making it through. Whereas if you voted for something else and you don't see it here, then that's perhaps more of an indication of maybe this is much lower chance of ever making it through, or at least anytime soon, and therefore perhaps you shift your priorities to something else. So that is still important reference, and for that reason, I think this is really big that CDPR is at least giving us this information. It helps us be more informed voters going forward, and that is very important for us to make better decisions about our voting. So again, Incubus, Riptide, Rainfarn, Madame Marquise Serenity, Joachim, in order for this season, and those are the 5 that actually made it through. Then Sove, that's a card that did get nerfed in the first season. This is not to cancel it out this time. This would have been to double down on the power decrease. So interesting that people still think that Sove is strong enough to warrant that. I know he was less common to use once he got that nerf. Granted, that is always the case whenever something gets nerfed, that it leads to players playing it less often. Sometimes, however, players overreact to that, and usually that is the case where a card might still be pretty solid, and yet people don't use it because they have the perception of it being much weaker. So I've heard some people saying that Sove, even in pro rank, was actually not half bad last season after the nerf, so perhaps that's where the second round of nerfs might be coming from. Willem, very rarely, if ever, see anyone play this. Obviously, it's a disloyal card, so power decrease in this case means it's actually getting stronger. So for that reason, yeah, I can see where people are coming from. Again, is it one of the cards that I would have prioritized? Perhaps not, but it's not crazy. Laura Doran, another disloyal card. I have not used her much. She's a very recent card, though, and at least when she works, has some pretty amazing potential. Kind of a higher risk type of card, but maybe people having a little bit trouble getting her to work, so maybe that's the reason why they want to lower her power, but I can't really speak any more to the specifics. Then Kraken, this is another one that I feel some mixed feelings about, because it's another card that, when used correctly, can be extremely strong. But if you don't get it to work, kind of like Laura Doran, since it's also a disloyal unit, it's risky because you're potentially just giving your opponents points. So, okay, I can kind of see where people are coming from there, but these two make me a little more nervous. Frenzy Dao obviously recently got a rework that made it significantly stronger, so presumably that's where people are coming from with the power decrease there. Tyr, this is a tough one. So I totally get why people are saying they want to decrease his power, because he is a really strong card. At least the evolving cards, usually there's one form that people greatly prefer to the other, and so in Tyr's case, it's the form where he's increasing the power of the cards in your graveyard, because there are a lot of synergies you can use with that. But the tricky thing with him is that right now he's at 9 base power, which means at least you can remove him immediately with several forms of tolerable, like Geralt or Leo, whereas if you drop him down to 8 power, yes, he technically is worth 1 less point. That's not going to make a huge difference though, because at least in that second form, most of his value comes from being an engine more so than a points land. Suddenly you have slightly fewer options to answer him, so I think really the answer here is probably more so on the provision side, because then yes, you're making him weaker, probably more significant of a nerf than a power decrease would be, but at least it's still possible to answer him with some of those tall removal cards, whereas if you decrease his power, that's still, you're not going to remove him with damage any more easily at 8 power than you are at 9 power. At least the 1 point difference there is almost insignificant, so unless you're going to power decrease him multiple times, this just isn't really going to make a big difference. And I say this all because this was a card that I very nearly voted for the power decrease category last time round, but didn't do it specifically for those reasons right there. Then Jan Calvet, that is a card that would have been a second vote, so a doubling down on the power decrease there. That's a card, it's not an engine. his high base power as a point slam is really just a bonus. It's all about the deployability. So it's really the provision side where changes would be much more significant if people do truly want to see him get nerfed further. Vigo, this would be a reversal of what happened last time around where he got buffed. So again, obviously none of these ones you see below the top 5 ended up happening, but if we had gotten the full 15 or some number in between 5 and 15 cards changed per category, then you would have seen these things happen. Demovind, that is a card that I voted for, but didn't quite make the cut here. Obviously, he's not quite as strong as he used to be now that he's been nerfed on the cooldown side, but felt like it would have been a very minor way to at least make him slightly weaker, since again, maybe he's not completely busted anymore, but at least from my perspective, I personally think that a lot of the highest end cards that people see a lot in the higher ranks of Gwent are still stronger than I would like them to be, and I would like the target for us to balance to be a little bit lower than that, and that's why I think Demovind could still use further nerfs, minor as it might be, just dropping him down by 1 point. Then Vi. This would be another one that would reverse what happened in the Season 1 vote. The base power on Vi is extremely important because it affects every single time that you consume and replay Vi, so that would be a pretty big deal. And there were a lot of people who were saying that they didn't like the way that Vi had become weaker. Power creep had made Vi less significant, / reducing the number of charges on Overwhelming Hunger inherently meant it was more difficult to consume Vi multiple times, which made Vi weaker. So that was, I assume, the reason why Vi got the buff last time round, and why I'm a little surprised that that would be one of the cards that people wanted to go back on. But again, very end of the list, so only just barely would have made the cut if we had gotten the full 15 last time round. Then for the provision increase this time around in ranked order, the 5 that we saw were Magic Compass, Reaver Scout, Muta Generator, Cyclops Warrior, and Golden Necker. Don't know if the order is of particular interest here. I mean, other than I'm a little surprised that Golden Necker dropped this low and almost didn't make the cut, since that was one of the cards that I really thought was going to get changed in the first season, somehow didn't get changed, and then I assumed that people were going to realize that they somehow overlooked that, and then a whole bunch of people were going to throw it on their lists and it would rise at or near the top, but not quite the case here. It almost didn't make it. But then we have Sove next, which almost but didn't quite make the cut, and obviously Sove you're gonna see popping up in a few different places here, but in this case, provision increase. We saw people try to, and did successfully, decrease his power before, and almost did so again, but people were also trying to approach it from a provision standpoint as well, so very clearly people are still concerned about Sove and his current state of power. Fruits of Vizgith, that is one that I had voted for. It is a leader ability, so in this case, we're talking about a buff for the provision increase rather than a nerf. It is currently the single lowest provision cost leader ability in the game. I've heard some people make a case that, technically there is 1 or 2 very strong Fruits of Vizgith control decks at the higher ranks. I mean, for me, Fruits of Vizgith is completely invisible. I have almost never seen anyone play this deck ever. Maybe it's one of those things where there's just a very small number of people who are successful with it, but I feel like that is so small of a number that it is still worth giving it some attention, because I think there are a lot of people who would like for this leader ability to be more effective, who are playing in a whole host of other ranks beyond just that select few near the top. Onager and Siege, both of which nearly got provision increases here. Onager, somewhat soon after it got released, got nerfed because it was clearly very strong, and to a certain extent still is extremely strong even after that nerf, so I can understand where people are coming from that standpoint. But Siege is a card that got buffed last time, so this provision increase would be to undo it, and obviously there's some synergies between Onager and Siege. Personally, I thought that Siege, well, is it the strongest scenario in the world? No. Technically speaking, by some accounts, it actually is, but it's certainly not the most common, so I could kind of understand where people were coming from the provision decrease standpoint that we got from the original vote, but still would have expected some other scenarios to have been the targets more so than Siege was, so I'm not too surprised to see, for that reason, people considering going back on that one. Roach, another card that had gotten the provision buff last time. I mean, Roach is a tough one where it's never going to single-handedly overwhelm you, because that's just not what the card does. It's just really convenient thinning, so it's for that reason a little bit tough to know at what point is Roach too strong. It was 9 provisions for a while, then it got nerfed to 10 provisions for a while, now it's back at 9, line, which one does it deserve to be at? You know, you can make a case for either one, I suppose. A jackpot, another one that at least previously was tied as the lowest provision leader ability in the game, but we did vote to increase the provisions by 1 previously. That almost got reversed here. I have not tried jackpot since adding that additional provision, so I can't really speak to whether that has completely changed the dynamic of playing that leader, but people were thinking that at the very least. Then Temple Melitele would have been a double down because it won on provision increase last time round, so this would be a second provision increase. Obviously, this is extremely strong. It does take a little bit of RNG to get it to roll well for you, but at the same time, the consistency of being able to draw into a card, get a huge buff on that card, at least in round 1, is pretty incredible. So I can still see where people are coming from. It might be deserving of another provision nerf there, and if we had gotten the full 15 votes going through here, then obviously that would have been the case. Then we have Enslave, another one to reverse a vote from last time round, and this one's concerning. It was pretty clear that Enslave was in need of a nerf last time round, and I understand that some people were concerned that Nilfgaard may have gotten more attention in the nerf category from the first vote than they would have liked, but that doesn't mean that all of the Nilfgaard nerfs were wrong. By a lot of accounts, Enslave deserved a nerf, so a little worried that people felt inclined to go back on that and would have successfully gone back on that had we gotten the full 15 votes going through on the provision increase side. Philippe, that's a card that had gotten a power nerf last time, and as one of the people who had voted for that, I can tell you that technically speaking, I wanted to increase the provisions rather than decrease the power. That would have been my preferred way to nerf him, but I had other cards that I was putting in the provision increase category, and so Philippe didn't quite make the cut. So from that standpoint, I can understand where people are coming from trying to increase his provision, because that is certainly something that would be more impactful than decreasing his power was, but obviously it didn't happen here. And is that still the case now that he's gotten a 1 point power nerf? Let's be honest, the 1 point power nerf is not really going to make a huge difference for Philippe. He's still somewhat difficult to remove with pure damage. It's more so the provision cost that's going to affect whether or not he actually gets included in decks, because at least that power nerf, he's still going to get put in the same decks he was put in before, and that's just not going to be the determining factor unless the provision cost changed. So then Hidden Cache, last one. This is not something that I've played very much of. It's a very uncommon deck, I think is pretty safe to say. So I think from that standpoint, it's understandable why this would pop up in the provision increase category. Therefore, again, for the leader abilities, that means a buff. So, but didn't happen here. And in fact, at number 15, even if we had gotten the full 15 in, only would have just barely made the cut. And one of the interesting dynamics as well, just more holistically to consider, is that Nilfgaard is the most popular faction. So from that standpoint, we can certainly see that Nilfgaard has a whole lot of influence on the balance changes, and that if something happens that Nilfgaard players don't like, they can fairly easily reverse that, and vice versa as well. If the Nilfgaard players want something to happen. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Syndicate, who is by far the least popular faction for people to play, and so you would think that for that reason, maybe you see less things pop up on the Syndicate side, at least on the buff side, because it might be that the people who play against Syndicate every once in a while, they say, well, that Syndicate deck is too strong, especially the top ranks, because Syndicate tends to be much more oriented toward the higher ranked players since it is generally more difficult to play. But you would think that there's only a very small number of people who are in those top ranks and playing Syndicate, and so to see Syndicate buffs appear is a little bit surprising, but honestly I think probably good, because that's a difficult factor to overcome, the whole, well, the number of players playing each faction is different aspect, because if it all came down to that, then Nilfgaard would always have the most buffs, and all the other factions would always have less, and eventually we'd get to Nilfgaard just runs away, becoming way stronger than everyone else, while the other factions, especially Syndicate at the bottom of the list, gets left behind. But anyways, moving on to the final category, provision decrease here. So we had, in ranked order, Vilga Forts, Open Sesame, Slave Driver, Thirsty Dame, and Eternal Eclipse. Those are the 5 that we actually saw happen, so now we at least see the order in which those appeared. Of those 5, I was probably most surprised to see Eternal Eclipse show up there, because it seemed like that, of the ones we had seen get nerfed, was the one that had the most support behind that nerf, and was the reason why I didn't really expect it to get reversed, because it seemed that that was going to stick. But that perhaps explains why we see it popping up here at number 5, where it only just barely made the cut. Obviously, these were all votes to undo the previous round of votes, which I think is a pretty big red flag. Obviously, some people disagreed with the first round of votes, but at a certain point, we need to accept the fact that there's a reason why people made those votes in the first place. You might not agree with them, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. And again, I think a lot of that comes down to, what is the level that people are trying to set as the threshold for what we are targeting for the various buffs and nerfs. Vilgefort's coming first. This is undoing a vote that I had done, so that is not something that I'm super thrilled about, but at the same time, there is a lot of resistance when I had explained why I had made that vote, and it's a very complicated card, so I understand why people didn't agree with me, but at the same time, I think that people are overlooking a lot of aspects of that card. Slave Driver, so this would be to undo what happened before, and I have seen a lot of people saying that that was a card that, along with Nazca Sergeant, both of those things getting their nerfs undone since they are so commonly used together was a bit alarming, since, if you nerf one of them, then maybe that gets them collectively to the place where you want them to be, but if you nerf both of them or buff both of them, then suddenly that's a pretty big swing. But then Bare Knuckle Brawler would have also been a vote to undo the previous round of votes, and obviously that only just barely missed the cut. And Passiflora, now talking about scenarios that perhaps were most in need of getting buffed, Passiflora, it almost happened for that, and I would say that, that's pretty high up on the list. I definitely would have said that that's more in need of a buff than Siege was, so unfortunate to see that it didn't quite make the cut. If we had gotten the full 15 or even just 10 cards changed per category, then it would have happened. Chapter of Wizards, I mean, honestly, it's almost a scenario in that it gives you ways to play multiple cards, and it's an artifact, which is basically what scenarios are. So kind of similarly to Passiflora, despite all those things being said, it was not quite as strong as some of those other things. Maybe that's an understatement. So yeah, it's understandable that people are looking to get that buffed. Granted, I don't see it played very often, so I didn't really realize that people were prioritizing it that much, but then again, perhaps that's why people wanted it to get buffed, because it wasn't strong enough for people to play it. Lilith's Omen, this is a little bit tough to gauge, because it's one of those cards that when you use it right, it can be great, but if you use it wrong, it's just absolutely atrocious. So obviously, if you're a good player, you can do more things to make sure that it works, or you can at least more consistently make it work. Whereas if you're less experienced with it, or you're just a newer player overall, not as strong a player overall, then you're more likely to see Lilith's Omen not work, and that can be really frustrating. But I have not used it much myself recently, so maybe overall people are just thinking as though it needs to get a little bit stronger. Then the Tweersock Skirmisher, this is another one that I'm a little surprised to see that popping up, to be honest with you. I think that's a pretty well-balanced card. When it works, it's great, and it has a very specific purpose that it serves, and it's very good at that purpose. It isn't supposed to be a card that is put into every single Skellige deck, and it used to be 4 provisions, wasn't? And at that point in time, it had gotten quite strong, and so much so that suddenly it was becoming something that was put into almost every single Skellige deck, despite how that's not supposed to be the case for such a specialized card. So, yeah, I think I disagree with this one. Yeah, it doesn't show up that often, but I think there's a good reason for that. Stefan, this would be to undo a change last time round. Stefan obviously is strong. I wasn't necessarily the card that I thought was most in need from the previous vote of getting a nerf. I could understand why it got it. So going back on that vote, which almost ended up happening, on one hand, I can understand why people feel as though that was an overreaction to try to nerf Stefan. On the other hand, I feel like, yes, Stefan was on the strong side. Was he the absolute strongest card? Usually not, although he does have some pretty insane high-end potential. So I would have had higher priorities that I would have wanted to have addressed first, but would I have eventually wanted to see Stefan get nerfed? Yeah, I still think he's stronger than we should be trying to make cards be. Then Portal, this is not a reversal. This would have been a double down on the power decrease here. So, and that's a card that, once upon a time actually was really good, but the other things around it have gotten stronger, and so Portal is not as good as it used to be because of power creep. So I can see the reason for buffing it here. It's still so soon after having buffed it that I feel like it's maybe a little preemptive to try to double down on it. Geralt Quen, yeah, obviously the cards that Geralt Quen can tutor are quite strong because he can tutor other Geralts, for example. On the other hand, there's generally a very small number of those cards, so for that reason, unlike, say, a tutor like Royal Decree that will have a bazillion targets for you in your deck, there's a much higher chance that you completely brick Geralt Quen, in which case he's a 2-point body for 10 provisions, which really stinks. Then again, I don't know if he's ever been used in anything other than Witcher spam decks. And then there's the whole giving a shield aspect, and how important is that? Well, there are some decks that, like Northern Realms, shields with Ragnar, very much like that. There are other decks where, it's convenient, yeah, but it's not really going to make or break the deck, so I don't really think that's a huge factor in it. So Geralt Gwen, could it use a provision buff? Yeah, maybe, because it certainly is not used very often right now, but at the same time, that might be more a symptom of how there just aren't great cards for Geralt Gwen to tutor right now, and maybe for that reason, if people want to see Geralt Gwen show up more often, the actual answer is more so to buff the other cards that Geralt Gwen would be tutoring, because then you'd have a reason to get Geralt Gwen. Mullane. That is a card that we had voted for and almost made the cut, would have made the cut if it were the full 15. Just one of those cards that is so underpowered and has been for so long that nobody has had any reason to play it for who knows how long at this point. So, I mean, honestly, one buff is probably not enough, but it's one of those cards where it seems like at a certain point, we need to try to target those cards, because if we're focusing exclusively on all the cards that are at or near the top of the top, then by the time we eventually make our way down to cards at Mullane's level, I mean, it's going to be years if we ever get there at all. So a lot of people have said that they want to buff those weak cards that never get seen, and yet here we are with these votes for Balance Council, and it seems like we've gotten few, if any of those at all. So encouraged to see that Mullane almost made the cut, but obviously I wish that she'd gotten a little bit higher up there. Then, last but not least, if we had gotten the full 15 votes for provision decrease to go through, we would have gotten Battle Stations reversed, so that its provision increase would have gotten canceled. Battle Stations is an extremely overpowered card. I don't need to tell you this. So I think this raised a lot of red flags just looking at the reactions from the tweet that was posted that announced this stuff. And then I think the images from the tweet got posted on Reddit, and I was taking a little peek at that as well. And this was the card that a lot of people pointed to and said, all right, well, this is a good reason why it was not the right idea to have the full 15 cards go through in each category, because buffing Battle Stations was not a rational thing to do. Because certainly there's the temptation after seeing some of the cards that you use, seeing some of the cards that you like getting nerfed, to want to undo those nerfs. But again, we have to think about what is best for the state of overall balance for Gwent, not just what is going to increase your personal win rate. We don't get to exempt ourselves from balance, because people wanted to continue to use that card for easy wins because that is what it was giving them, and that is not something that we should be encouraging with our Balance Council votes. But that is all of them. So not only do we see what those cards were that almost made it through, but not quite, we also get them in ranked order, which again, I think is very helpful looking forward so that we can better understand, okay, what is worth trying to focus on in the future, what is completely out of the question, or at least is far away enough that it's pretty unlikely, because, take anything that falls in this 6 to 15 range, and you got pretty close, so maybe it is possible to make those things happen, especially if people see this type of thing and get encouraged by it. Whereas if you have something that it seems like you got a fair bit of support on, or maybe you just took a wild guess and you don't have any indication here of it making an appearance, then maybe it's time to put that aside for the time being and maybe scrap it altogether, or just try to circle back on it on a later occasion when other higher priority cards have been addressed. And CDPR, if you see this, then please continue to give us this type of information, because it helps us be smarter voters, which is, of course, in everybody's best interest. But that's about it. So lots of interesting things for us to talk about, and let me know what stands out most to you and what you learned from what you see here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.